Good morning. Sorry for the mysterious lighting here. It's early in the morning out on the farmhouse, and I wanted to get a video done for the quiz review for quiz 6. Um, and so that quiz will be up until Tuesday for you. Actually, I'm not late this time, but just in case something goes wrong at the office and I can't get this up until tonight, but we'll see how everything goes. Now, the quiz covers the reading that was mentioned, well listed in your reading for the week. I didn't get to the. I just got to mention a little bit Carolyn Forche's poem, "The Colonel," which I didn't put on the quiz, nor are there any questions about the pyrotechnic. Um, Naipaul's or Nightfall, as as Derek Walcott calls him in the spoilers return. Um, and there are questions up to chapter 19, I believe, from Crick Crack Monkey, which we'll finish up early in the week. We have one more novel to read, and we'll start looking in there. And I have a couple of films I hope to show you. One of them is 10 Canoes. It's about Aboriginals. It goes with the book, and there's a movie version for the novel we'll be reading over these next weeks. Now, in Microbus to San Salvador, I did mention, and the one of the heroes of the revolutions in Central America is Archbishop Omar Romero. I call him a cardinal. And he was, in fact, assassinated for his political views and activities in Mass while he was giving Mass. So there's a lot of references to him and to Thomas à Becket, who was, in fact, assassinated in the cathedral after Mass, I think, by King Henry I, I believe, his guards Templar just did him in. And so he remains a hero to many, many people, remembering that Central America is a deeply religious, Christian, Catholic, largely area of the world. So thus all the excitement for the new Pope. Now, in Microbus to San Salvador, the woman, the narrator, has two sons, and she's going to testify against Corporal Martinez. And you don't know it really, but I mean, it's suggested in the context of the assassination of her, or the killing of her husband, whom you meet in the narrative as well. And as I mentioned in class, in the Microbus de San Salvador, the narrator, she expresses deep, expresses not regret for going to the city, Chalate, and learning about the revolution. In fact, she's happy. In an ambivalent way. I mean, after all, the revolution has taken the life of many people she knows, but in particular her husband. And the two kids are raised by the grandmother, that beacon of tradition, and the narrator is Nor in the name of, in the area of modernity, and the two of them try to come together through her. Says that she's glad she took the advice because she didn't want to be a victim, innocent victim, a peasant who's gunned down or had his heads cut off. She is involved in a cause, and that gives her a sense of identity and purpose to her life. Now, we didn't, maybe that's next week, I can't remember. Octavio Paz is a Nobel Prize winning author from Mexico. And he wrote something in the vein of magic realism called the Obsidian Butterfly. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. But when Octavio Paz gave his speech after he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. That's traditionally what happens. Um, he gave a big address about the necessity for cultures to bridge gaps between modernity and tradition. So I didn't make this kind of polarity up. And because to just go with modernity or just go with tradition, or they become moribund in particular, and no one makes any progress. But these stories we've seen, so many of them, all the way from, I'd say, Tears in the collector, Bessie Head's Collector of Treasures, where she is very traditional in many ways, but on the other hand, knows the importance of an education and things along those lines. I'm glad we had a chance to read A Far Cry from Africa by Derek Walcott, um, which is, as I said, very different from Guillen's poem, The Cuban Poet, about his African versus his conquistador relatives. And in the poem, A Far Cry from Africa, um, Walcott looks at the country that's still in turmoil, but he's from there. But he's also has Dutch in him. Um, and in this poem, among other things, he attests to his love for the English language, even if he can never really reconcile himself to the violence that continues in Africa and the violence done by his white ancestors. But he, like he says elsewhere, he got a really good education, and these kinds of things, and writes beautiful, beautiful drama and poetry, and some very challenging poetry, as we saw in the long, for a poem it might seem, The Spoiler's Return. And here is the spoiler who returns from the dead, if you will, and comes back and sings a calypso. And among other things, the spoiler, in addition to suggesting that the spoiler's calypso song is of an equal to John Donne, Marshall, Pope, and any number of other famous writers who wrote in, well, Marshall and I'm trying to think of the other. Juvenal wrote in Latin, but nonetheless, that his writing is on a par with all these people. That's a real prideful and wonderful boast. Although his Nobel Prize would suggest that many people see that he has accomplished that, coming from the small island of Saint Lucia. He is in many ways the spoiler, and what he does with the poem is also suggests that despite all the oil in Trinidad, that how little some things have changed for the island's poor, and there's the sort of the progressive side of calypso, singing about contemporary issues. And he attacks, because we read in class that one section where, the suits remain the same, even if the color of the person who wears them has changed. That and we talked about this kind of thing in other contexts, calling, among other things, neo-colonialism. That is to say that the islanders take over, but they rule the way they were ruled, which was not a democracy. Another author from Trinidad now is Earl Lovelace, and in fact, the poem "The Spoiler" is dedicated to Earl Lovelace, Trinidad's formidable author, particularly of novels. He has written some plays, but I used to use his novels in this class, so they're wonderful. And in the story, Shoemaker Arnold is probably around 50 years old, middle-aged, and hardened in his ways, if you will, leading an insular life that rejects everybody. And we find out that he has his friends Norbert. In the end, he drinks with Norbert, and he remembers that how much he'd like to be with this girl who reminds him of the scent of moss and aloes, and he would dance with her. And now she's come in to the shop. And Arnold, after she leaves, and this is one of the, we didn't talk about it in class, but the turning point, if you will, in the story, that Norbert has well, I'd say a smoothing effect on Arnold. He opens his horizons, opens the front door, if you will. The girl comes in, and she's really not afraid of Arnold. And after she leaves, he tells Norbert that the shop needs some pictures and paper bags, like a real establishment, paper bags to put in the shoes he fixes and things like that. And so we see Arnold opening up to the world around him. And so almost a little bit of a rebirth, if you will, at the end of the story. All really good literature that we've been reading from Central America. And when we'll be finishing up our novel. As I said, I think the questions here go to, around, I'd say, chapter 19. I'll be finishing the rest of the novel for the beginning of the week. Now, when T visits Ma in the countryside, I know that I think I probably asked a question about this the last test, but I wanted to just reinforce the contrast that you find between T's going with Auntie Beatrice to their summer place, as opposed to what happens in the countryside. And again, there is this this friction between what we can call tradition, and Ma certainly represents tradition, and more in the terms of modernity, which may not be so good in terms of, let's say, Norman and his wife, Aunt Beatrice, and the three daughters there. And the sort of the dysfunctional family. And despite all the chaos with Ma and Tante, there's order. There's order there. And so Ma tells T that she reminds her of her own grandfather, come back again. But she just can't quite remember her grandmother's name, her true name. And this will go on towards the end of the book, and suggesting how by the end of the story you're going to see that the young girl who grows and narrates the novel is caught between these two worlds. And we find out the Prejudice too is a something you may not have experienced before in life or in literature, and this is this black on black prejudice. So when T first visits Beatrice, Bernadette, and I think there's an error I have to correct. I think I called her, I hit an N instead of a B. But at any rate, the eldest daughter, picks on Todden, the little chubby kid, calling him a flat nose. And we'll find that this is developed because Aunt T. Beatrice teaches her children this kind of a thing about why they're better than those people who live out in the countries who, look like blacks from Africa, and they're not white, paler skinned and with different kind of noses, because they call them flat. They call them flat nose, and when that, and then later, she will be back with Tante after Selwyn, obviously behind the scenes has sent material necessary, like paperwork that says that Tante has custody of the children. Well, and then we follow T through school, because right away, the beginning of school, when she went to Heinz and the rest, all she thought about was how wonderful it would be to run your finger across the book and have meanings revealed to you, and things along those lines. She loves learning, despite sometimes the school environment. When she attends the EC school, her teacher, and this is Sir, he likes to rest the tamarind whip delicately across his knees. And he likes to beat the children too. And he does beat T after she goes to the manor, and then goes to see Mr. Thomas, the principal, and when she comes back to class, he beats her with the tamarind, and she won't cry. And then when she does it loudly and loudly so that it'll raise tension. And the one thing Sir doesn't want is having the principal come. But otherwise, he's very mean-spirited, and T survives him, which is a test to her intelligence. And you have the contention between the East school is obviously the Protestant school, and the color of the girls' uniform at the EC school, the Roman Catholic or the Catholic students referred to the EC schools as Caca sisters because of their brown uniforms. So there's out on the savannah, the area where they all play, there's a lot of contention. They steal boys' shorts and whatnot. But I like that, the Caca sisters, because of the color of their uniforms. Now, Mr. Braithwaite is the owner of the estate, and there are all these things associated to go there, and they go there to steal fruit. And 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 she's so wrapped up in getting her tamarind. Is it tamarind? I think it is the fruit at the estate, that he comes upon her, and she thinks he's a ghost or something, and she calls him a whitey cockroach. So Mr. Braithwaite is the owner of the state, and he would be, and his ancestors would probably have been slave owners, and raised things like limes and other things for during the British colonial period, and still has an estate there. Now, as punishment for bad mouthing Mr. Braithwaite, Mr. Thomas, unlike Sir, who beats her until she screams, Mr. Thomas just says, yeah, I caught tail myself for stealing fruit from that area, and your mother, your auntie Tanti was, the principal was afraid of her because, boy, if she would give you, a what for if she had things on her mind. He says, I don't know what I'm going to do with you, and basically just sends her back to class because in many ways he's impressed. And so she goes back to class, and that's where Sir beats her. In school, I'd like there is the one thing about how wonderful it is to learn. And on the other hand, remember that when she's at school, she's learning British, and she doesn't see herself in the literature. She's kind of sees herself as the negative in a photograph of who are in the books, and then the meaning always what she calls reality and rightness, and they were always to be found abroad, and that would be coming from the mother country, where of hope and glory, and to transport herself into the books, if you will, T fashions a double that she names Helen. And Helen was always trying to be what she called proper, so that they would have tea and biscuits, and not the food that she eats. In other words, Helen is more closely related in the long run to what the kinds of kids Beatrice wants to raise. Very good white girls on the British model, not associated with the traditions of the blacks who populate Trinidad. They take their meaning from away from the country, whereas Merrill Hodge in her book is basically, as I have said before, giving voice in many respects to the voiceless people who just never showed up in the novels about the area. Now, Mickey is good to the kids. He works at an American base to make money. And as happens quite frequently, Mickey does a good job. He's not 18, he's 17. He's given the opportunity to go to the United States to make a lot more money. And although she's afraid of the prejudice that Mickey will meet, in the United States, and she loves him, despite the fact that she fights with him all the time. And she agrees to sign a release um, so that Mickey can go to the United States, and he sends packages back all the time, which is a very familiar motif in Caribbean literature. So often the families are without a husband because the husband's gone, making money in the United States, Panama, and other places. But now the same kind of thing happens with respect to tea, because Auntie Tante Rose is her real name. Um, when after T scores well on the test for her at her EC school, which so she can go to an excellent high school, St. Anne's, as a Catholic school. Tante allows T to go live with Norman and Beatrice so that she can go to St. Anne's and receive a solid education. And they're realizing that Tante does that, in fact, in order for people to succeed, for someone as smart as T, she needs an education. So um, she sacrifices what she would prefer for the good of the child, with ambivalent results, as we come to find out, because the Catholic school is incredibly racist, as T starts to figure out all the girls that the nuns and everybody choose to be um, members of the clubs or whatever, the elite groups, like choir and whatnot. They all seem to be the same fair-skinned children, like um, two of Beatrice's children, but not Jessica. Um, and T gets to look at, and Beatrice's glorifies in a picture in the living room of the white ancestress named Elizabeth Helen Carter. So she blames Norman that Jessica has dark skin. And she tells her daughter that Jessica has to work harder because she, unlike her sisters, has dark skin. And Beatrice takes pleasure, and also a large part of her life, from the fact that she's not black, and that she has white in her. And Elizabeth Helen Carter. Um, so this mixture makes her superior to those around her, and it makes with sometimes you feel sorry for her, and other times when people are making fun of her, um, as when she drags T for ballet lessons, and the woman who's there wants nothing to do with Beatrice, and Beatrice refuses to speak the Creole, and behind her back, people make fun of her. And she's pathetic in her own way. But we do see, and this is important, that given her association, T's association with the school, and being around Beatrice, and seeing all the nice things, and while she doesn't get along well at all with the daughters, and then is drawn and repelled at the same time by Aunt Beatrice, she changes her attitudes. Now, and I think it shows really well when T goes to the carnival, um, but we doesn't go to Mooney's wedding. Beatrice calls it a coolie affair. Um, she goes to the carnival with Aunt Beatrice and sits with the proper people and the tourists to watch what goes on. And now she views Tante and Tatum and Ramla with what she describes as a haze of shame. She's looking down on himself. She doesn't fit in with Beatrice. So when Easter vacation approaches, the time when she would go to stay with Ma, um, she decides that she tells Tante in a letter that she'll go to Canapo, to see a new place instead of going to Ma's, and she on her own. And this is a sort of a separation point, if you will. She looks with shame upon her own past, her own relatives who live out not in the Grange, they live out in the countryside as somehow less than um, almost human. But she doesn't, that certainly doesn't fit in with Norman and Beatrice. And that comes to the head when they go to the beach. Um, and Beatrice has made this wonderful meal to impress the Silvas, obviously better upper class, or what she assumes is upper class, and the daughters won't bring the kids over after Beatrice goes through all this stuff to prepare this meal that she ends up putting covers over, like to keep the food fresh. They go to the walk on the beach where the crabs are, and Beatrice slips down to touch, hold, if you will, um, T's hand and its solidarity against her own daughters who have turned their back on her, and T just whacks the hand away, and it's that point that the divide between the T and Beatrice takes hold, and then she gets chastised by Beatrice for using the wrong kind of spoon to eat with rice with, and just gets bashed all the time. Well, you'll see what happens as you read on. And now the separation is going to be from Beatrice, but also um, she feels she doesn't feel comfortable either around her aunt and Todd and the rest of her friends from up in the hills. All right, do a good job on the quiz, and I'll see you in class on Monday.